Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm your host, Toshiki Hirano, and you are now watching Architecture Informatics Society channel, where we invite people who are working in the realm of digital technology and architecture. And for tonight's guest, we have Ghali Bouayad, architect currently based in Tokyo. So, こんばんは。今日はよろしくお願いします。
はい、よろしくお願いします。
はい。ガリさんはですね、今年の春に、東京芸大の博士課程を修了したんですけども、その博士論文がですね、ポストデジタルの、時代における、装飾というものでした。で、今日はですね、皆さんと一緒にその博士論文についてですね、ガリさんにお話を聞きたいと思います。ただ、30分という時間なので、細部にわたって話を聞くというよりかは、その全体的な大まかなこう流れについて、アイデアについてお話を聞けたらと思います。So he finished his PhD at Tokyo University of Arts, or Geidai, this spring. And the title of his dissertation is Postdigital, Ornamented Architecture is Not Ornamented, which sounds super interesting. So together with our listeners, I want to discover what he did in his project. But before going to the dissertation, first, I want to ask Ghali about his background. So まずはじめにですね、簡単に自己紹介をしていただきたいなというふうに思います。So you have quite interesting background, and I think many of our listeners are wondering how you ended up getting a PhD at Geidai. So can you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to speak tonight before you. I think for the background, it will be much more easier if I just share screen my about page, and I can walk you through. Basically, I am a Moroccan-born architect. And I left my country about 10 years ago already. I did my first 2 years in the National School of Architecture in Morocco. I'm not putting in here on my website in order not to confuse too much the visitors, otherwise too many institutions. So I spent 2 years there where I got very technical, let's say, teaching and knowledge. And then I left for Paris La Villette Architecture School, which is one of the national schools in France. And I finished my undergrad, my bachelor there. I started my master's. And then for the last year, I went as an exchange for an exchange program in the G.S.D of Kyushu University, Kyushu Daigaku, where I wrote my thesis and made my graduation projects. And right after, I went back for 2 years to France to work. So I worked for Atelier Cresson de Ports-en-Parc and Jacob McFarlane, which are very popular, I think, within the computation community. And of course, during that, before that, I was doing internships, Su Fujimoto Architects, Riki Yamamoto, other smaller offices, working on multiple kinds of phases, for development of projects. And then while working, somehow I just realized that I wanted to learn more. I need more knowledge, and honestly, I just didn't want to work for someone. And rather than that, I would just invest my energy and my time and just work 15 hours a day, invest that time in myself, and that was the PhD. So. And then I started looking into programs. Going back to Japan was just very charming, and that idea very pleasing as well. So I heard of a scholarship, a fellowship from the Monbukagakushou, the Japanese Ministry of Education, which is paying for the full tuition. And gives an allowance to live in. So I think it was ideal to have a PhD that is fully sponsored. And I prepared for it. I got the fellowship, and I Tokyo University of the Arts was my choice because it was I wanted to work with Professor Mitsuhiro Kanada, which is both an architect and engineer trained. I knew about him when I did this competition back in 2015. I did it with 3 other friends and some members of the Kyudai lab I was with. And we got the second prize, but the first prize winner, I realized after, it was actually one architect from Kansai, and Kanada Mitsuhiro was the engineer behind. So yeah, making a PhD with the guy we lost, it was kind of interesting. And also being inside the structural lab, inside an architecture department, inside an art university was a very pleasing idea. So I also wanted to train in order after a few years, if I get in a room with artists, with the curators, with the engineers, scientists, or architects, I can fully be able to have a discussion with all of them without losing my legitimacy as an architect. So yeah, I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. So just quickly, summarize in Japanese. 見ても分かる通り、これウェブサイトなんですが、ここには書いてないんですが、最初モロッコの大学で学部をして、でその後パリのラビレット建築大学に行って修士を行って、でその途中に九州大学の方に留学をしていたという、形ですね。でその後東京芸大の博士課程、カナダ光弘先生の研究室に進むわけなんですけれども、ですね、その九州大学にいたときに、2015年に、コンペに応募して2等を取った、そうです。で、その2等を取った時のコンペで1等を取った案のエンジニア、構造のエンジニアが実はカナダ先生だったということで、そういったいろんな奇遇もあって、でさらにその芸大、その美術大学、芸術大学の中に、ある構造の研究室、そういったアートとエンジニアリングと建築、そういったいろんな交差するという、非常に興味深い環境ということで、カナダ圏に進んだということですね。で、ちょっと追加でお聞きしたいのが、いつですね、今回建築情報学会ということもあるので、いつコンピュテーションデザインの領域に足を踏み入れたのかなということをお聞きしたいと思います。So, when did you get into the realm of computational design? Is it like somewhere when you were working for Jacob McFarlane, for instance?
Not really. I think just likely I was just I landed in a course back in my master's in France, and I found the tool very interesting and helpful for the development of a project. And yeah, it was always a tool. And for instance, my graduation project and my thesis for the masters were really linked to social aspects of architecture. So it wasn't any computation, and also during my PhD, my doctoral investigations, I tried to stay focused as much as possible on the theoretical and the aesthetics discourse, and see how we can actually use the computation tools to raise a new narrative for architecture and space design.
Thank you. So, そうですね。修士の時の修士政策というのは、どちらかというと社会的な建築のあり方ということが関心のテーマで、コンピュテーションデザインはそこまで関係がなかったということです。で、今回お話を聞く博士論文、博士政策に関しても、コンピュテーションデザインのテクノロジカルな技術的なところというよりかは、むしろ理論的なところに着目、フォーカスをして、でその中で美学であったりとか、そういった問題、そういった考察をどのようにコンピュテーションデザインと関係させて発展させていくかということがキーワードだったという そういった形ですね。はい。So, now, じゃあ、博士論文について、聞いていきたいと思います。で、ガリさんのですね、博士論文のキーワードの一つが、ポストデジタル、ということで、あまり多くの人にとって、馴染みのないものかと思うんですけれども、ポストデジタルという、言葉、これ一体、何かということをまず最初にお聞きしたいと思います。So, now let's move on to your dissertation. And you use this term, post-digital, which may be unfamiliar to many of our listeners. So could you explain what post-digital is?
Sure thing. Post-digital indeed is a word that emerged, I guess, in 2019 when Gilles Retine from the Bartlett guest edited the architectural design issue on the discrete discourse. So there is, I think the word has manifold meanings, has many meanings. So one of them is how Gilles actually talks about the technical approach to architecture and the materialization of it, the fabrication. So rather, for example, than have a complex geometry and then rationalize it into flat parts that will combine together, he will describe the material as being digital or post-digital, meaning that there is a relationship between the part and the whole, and the architecture will emerge from the combination of a digital material that is able to construct the shape. On my side, I didn't focus on that discourse, but rather on the social media context of the word. So, for instance, Adam Fury, who works in the States, and through his he published an essay in Aesthetics Equal Politics, created by Mark Foster Gage, and then he explained that, for instance, post-digital scholarship tracks the transition of digital technology from extraordinary to ordinary. So the post, that word is not actually to signify a time before or after the digital, but rather it is to describe an evolution of the digital to date. And in that same essay, he brings the example of Junya Watanabe show in 2011, where he showed this jeans, these sweatpants, and where actually they are not Levi's jeans, but they are a digital high-resolution scan of a denim jeans. So you cannot make the difference visually. They are not denim; they are made of cotton linen material, and this was part of a strategy of, for example, brands like Comme des Garçons to make their designs more comfortable without compromising on the aesthetics. So the computation, the post-digital show us that computation is not actually limited to computer, it's actually all around us in society. And it impacts us in an ontological way, empirically and aesthetically. So Adam also talks about this concept being linked to the transcoding word that was raised by Lev Manovich, which is a media theorist, and he's demonstrating this by talking about how designers and architects, rather than use solid black and blueprints colors, they are now using an ecology of digital gradients colors to make their drawings. And this happens at the moment when the rendering engines are becoming much more sophisticated and much more realistic. So we can produce photorealistic skies by just a push of a button. But still, we prefer, this post-digital architects, they prefer to produce such drawings. So for instance, the drawing on the left is a master plan by Aoki Sensei, Aoki Jun, for the Omiyamae projects. And on the right, it's Sandra Yukana and Luke Pearson for their video game urbanism department. So architects are not using computers, they are not using the digital to draw, to visualize the real, but actually the computation becomes a real in itself. So yeah, that is what I meant by the post-digital.
Thank you. I will really briefly summarize into Japanese. ポストデジタルですね、いろんな意味があって、大体2019年から使われ始めたということで、一つはジル・リツシン、バートレットで教えている先生ですね、が使っている技術的な意味のポストデジタルというのがあるんですけども、それというよりかはむしろその社会的、文化的な文脈でのポストデジタルというのをガリさんは着目しています。で、一言で言うと、ポストデジタルというのは、デジタルテクノロジーがエクストラオーディナリーなものからオーディナリーなものに変わった後の世界と言ったらいいんでしょうかね。ですね、何を言おうかな。このドローイングとかですね、コンピューターで作ってるわけですけれども、コンピューターでそれまでだと非常にフォトリアリスティックなドローイングを作ったり、レンダリングを作ったりしてたわけですけれども、そうではなくて、ここではこういう、単色を使ったりとか、してるわけですね。で、これは、それまでのフォトリアリスティックな、レンダリングっていうのは、デジタルテクノロジーを使って、我々の物理的な世界を、シミュレーションするというか、肉薄させるような形で使ったわけですけれども、こういったポストデジタルのものっていうのは、どちらかというとそのコンピューテーショナルデジタルテクノロジー自体にもまた別の現実、リアリズムがあるっていう、そういった前提に立っているということですね。そういった前提を指すためにポストデジタルという言葉を使っているという形でしょうかね。I have to go really quickly. Please forgive me, that I'm kind of abbreviating lots of your details. But anyways, 博士論文のですね、もう一つのキーワードについてお聞きしたいと思います。で、もう一つのキーワードが装飾ですね。で、博士論文の中では、装飾についての議論の中で、日本の型紙というものについて論じています。で、一体型紙っていうのは何なのかっていうのと、あとそれがですね、型紙っていうのがどういうふうに建築の装飾の問題と関係しているのか聞いてみたいと思います。So, another key concept of your dissertation is ornament, and you're discussing katagami, traditional Japanese stencil works in relation to the issue of ornament. So could you talk about what katagami is and how that touches on the issue of ornament in architecture?
Oh, sure. Okay. First, well, katagami are the stencil design that artisans and artists are using to actually carve the minowashi paper, and then they used that negative shape in order to paste on clothes, and that way we produce patterns and ornaments on yukatas and kimonos. So the use of patterns in architecture is not new, but when I started this research, I noticed that actually architects mostly just use the patterns on walls and ceilings, but by remapping them and giving them thickness. So since we are actually in the second digital turn of architecture, or perhaps beyond that time, we have more technology to produce more geometrical shapes and more data, and also we have the fabrication tools, 6 aces, robotic arms, and so we can actually push beyond the surface. And that's how the research actually started. So when I saw these katagami patterns and I started studying it, every pattern is actually made of many layers, several layers that are actually flattened up. So one of my early hypotheses were, what if when I translate these katagami patterns into space, would I get this layering of space, this layering in three-dimensional? Then in more theoretical parts, the fact that these patterns were linked to the textile production, it highlighted the connection to Gottfried Semper, which is this theorist, and he was writing about the connection between the relationship between costume, textile, and architecture production. And he was saying that actually the ornament is highly linked to the action of weaving and embroidery. So we can understand better the decoration and the movement through the ito, through the fiber, and not through the brush. And when we see etymologically the origin of these patterns in Japan, they all relate to the common, which is this crest pattern that were imported from China. And that kanji, when broken down, we can actually see the ito, which is the thread, and the mon. So yeah, that was one of the reasons. And finally, since these Katagami patterns were actually carved and leave behind this kind of point shapes, when I saw a pattern, I just imagine it as being used for computation, because currently the source of every topology is just 3D points and coordinates organized in data trees. So yeah, for me, it was very relevant to try and explore with these patterns.
Interesting. Okay. ですね、型紙っていうのは何かというと、浴衣であったり着物とかを染める時のこの穴を開けパターンでこう切り込みを入れて模様を作って、それをこう、着物の上に置いて染めるための、型紙なんですけれども、その何かこうそれで何層もこう重ねて、そういう型紙を使ったりするんですね。でそのこう重なっているものが、実際にこう、空間的なこう重層に展開できるのではないかというのが一つの発想だったわけです。で、装飾ですね。装飾っていうのは、ゴットフリード・ゼンパーに言えば、何かこうテキスタイル、と関係していると。テキスタイルというのはこう糸が、こう組み合わさってできているものですけども、つまりその装飾っていうのは、こう紐解いていくと、そういうこう紐の動き、みたいなものを、こう表彰しているものであると。そういったムーブメントをこう表彰しているものであると。で、その中から、ですね、なんて言ったらいいかな。これなかなか難しいですね。そういうこう、家紋とかも、そういったものであるというふうに言ってるんですけども、そういった中でこう空間的にそういう型紙というのを重層的に展開していくことで、装飾、というものの、問題をこう掘り下げていけたらなという、そういった考えで、型紙と、装飾という、ところに着目したという、ふうにまとめたいと思います。ちょっとだいぶはしょってますが、すいません。で、
So
yeah.
So patterns being a kind of ornament, I just placed this topic within, a bigger enclosure for the research. And since ornament was always a topic of discussion and polemic inside the architecture world, so it just makes sense to enlarge it to that. I'm just gonna skip the theoretical part because I think our audience is much more interested in seeing visuals and the output of the physical output of the practice-based research conducted inside the University of the Arts. So just very quickly, ornament was always the subject of it was a paradox. It is either structural or non-structural. It is decorative or belongs to the architecture itself. It is added. We can remove it or not. So these questions also were raised within the modern era. So, anyway, I'm gonna skip all of this. One aspect of ornament that I was also interested in was actually if ornament can be moved from one object to the other. I mean, the meaning of the ornaments. This theory was raised by Yoshitake Doi, which is an architecture historian, and he was raising this speculative idea that actually Kenzo Tange, the reason why he's given this this roof shape to his architecture were because he wanted to put this spiritual meaning that he actually took from the Ise shrine in Mie Prefecture. So for me, this roof, this object as is, gets the spiritual characteristic and meaning. The other ornament is for this topological condition that we can find, for example, in the Louvre Museum, which is the slightly curved a characteristic of architecture. So anyway, I started practicing and doing my own research. I started with top-down investigations, trying to transform these architectures from 2D to 3D, which raised also the question of what is actually being three-dimensional, what is being bi-dimensional, how this can actually affect while we move around the architecture. So I tried with Koshi patterns, I tried with Asanoha, and actually traced this. For example, here while turning, we can see an immersion ornaments. And then after I found that actually top-down method is very limited, so I started using bottom-up algorithms to actually give the ability to this Katagami topology geometry to actually emerge in space and start self-organizing and creating architectures. So you can see here the original pattern and how it emerges using different behaviors. And so we can see this in the short movie. For example, here there is a flocking behavior combined to a sigmoid behavior where actually these particles are reacting to the local condition, for example, the lighting environment, etc., adding more branches, and so on. So the previous architecture was materialized, for example, into this architecture wall, different patterns, different aesthetics, different outputs, and so on. However, I found that actually, even using this bottom-up methodology wasn't actually much more different than architects that are just remapping it on a ceiling and on a surface and taking in the pattern. So at that time, I crossed by this theory by Alina Payne, and she was actually trying to understand in a new way what modernism and ornament was about. And she was introducing this idea that actually Le Corbusier and Amédée aux Enfants, Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, that actually ornament was not present, but it was relocated into furniture and objects of daily life. So she's asking if this move from ornament to object is not a move from something we can see, something from optic to something we can touch. So from there, I actually wondered what if we can combine ornament to become an object at an architecture scale as a space. So I started actually scaling up these ornaments, these patterns, and I speculate how we can actually place architectural space inside of them. So for example, here you can see I place furniture and I try to imagine how we can use the space. So different pattern, different kind of space, and then different behavior to actually make them emerge and produce architecture.
Cool.
Sorry, I will keep going before I give you the hand to translate.
Sure. Go ahead.
To the community. So as you can see here, the behavior is very different and is actually creating these enclosures that can host, for example, a human body or whatever. And from there, it generates, for example, this pattern here generates this architecture. So all these polylines were like recreated through a mesh, thickened, and then the space emerged. Different pattern, different architecture. And then speculatively, we can imagine, for example, an urban context where a tower is made of different floors, made of a pattern on each level that can host an architecture. So as it is a practice-based research, I needed to verify my theory. And I decided to build actually the space in order to just so it doesn't stay theoretical. And it was materialized through a wood pavilion, which, okay, and then at the end, it was, I'm just looking at the clock, it's, I think it's time, but I constructed it for the graduation show that was held at the museum. And then a cluster from that pattern previously shown was chosen. And then I rationalized it in order to be able to fabricate it by hand. So at the end, it was a cluster made of 62 columns, made of about 300 wood chunks. And then I would just, put all the information on the wood, draw the joints, and then use very simple tools to cut everything and place and move to the final assembly. So we have this extremely complex geometry that was entirely materialized through simple table saw and a Japanese nomi for the half flat joints.
Interesting. Going back to this issue of ornament, or maybe I need to really make it quick.
Right.
Ornament is not something which you attach to the object, like something superficial, but something which is embedded to the object. And then also the ornament is not something which is as you show in the Le Corbusier's Esprit Nouveau pavilion, that something like a table or furniture, small scale thing, but it could be the building itself. So, and what is really interesting about your installation or your project is that you're not really negating the ornament as something two-dimensional or something a small object, but you're somehow integrating an ornament as 2D and 3D, and then also small object to large scale object. So you're really kind of branching different dimensions, different scales, and then you see ornament something as kind of goes over one realm to the other. So that's how I found it quite interesting about your dissertation. Unfortunately, we are reaching towards the end of the show. I think we should make the show into 1 hour to really go in more depths. But maybe we can just skip this. Oh, maybe we can just briefly talk about your expectation in this architecture informatics society, and then after that, can you briefly introduce the guest speaker for the next session on the September 2nd?
Absolutely. Expectations from the Japanese Society of Architecture Informatics. I don't really have expectations, but rather just actually congratulate you guys on starting this and just spread the discourse within Japan. And I think the more these tools become democratic, the more people can materialize space. And I think we should definitely build architectures, and it doesn't need to be big. It can be a chair, it can be a stool, it can be whatever, as long as we don't stay theoretical. So this digital era gives means to young architects to build and to verify everything through materiality. Regarding the next session, I will be the host on September 2nd, and my guest will be the Studio U plus P, made of so Luke Pearson and Sandra Yukana, who are practicing architects based in London, and educators in the Bartlett School of Architecture. And they work with video games to trigger narratives in the virtual world and bring them back to the real world. And I think it's gonna be an exciting discussion. So I'm very looking forward to it.
Great, sounds pretty exciting. Okay, thank you so much for the conversation. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next session. So thank you.